So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening. It's my task to take the place of Dr. Lefebvre, which who asked me to transmit you. Apologize to because she is not able to be here tonight, and to thanks people who lent us this place to host these meetings, the École supérieure du journalisme de Lille. And thanks to, and I must emphasize that our exchange with Ascodox Psy, which is a group of documentalists in psychiatric hospital, and group which made us for our events the bibliography you find right in here. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce you Kengo Miyazono, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Hokkaido, and I will let you in the hands of Alexandre Billon, which is professor of philosophy here at the University of Lille, and will chair this meeting. Thank you for the happy few. Yeah.
Oui, je voulais remercier la Fédération de recherche en psychiatrie, l'ESJ, et l'Université de Lille aussi qui a invité Kengo Miyazono. Et je vais juste dire quelques mots pour le présenter. Kengo a écrit une monographie sur les délires qui s'inscrit dans une tradition qui a commencé dans les années 90 à partir de travaux de psychiatrie neurocognitive et de travaux en philosophie de la connaissance anglo-saxonne. Et ces deux champs de recherche se sont hybridés et ça a donné une tradition assez riche qui étudie notamment les délires et qui aujourd'hui s'intéresse de plus en plus à des croyances étranges qui ne sont pas délirantes mais qui sont conspirationnistes ou négationnistes et qui peuvent avoir une certaine parenté avec les délires. Et Kengo Miyazono travaille beaucoup là-dessus. Il travaille notamment sur un livre qui défend une théorie sociale des délires et il cherche dans cette série de présentations, dont c'est la deuxième aujourd'hui, il cherche notamment à situer les délires par rapport aux autres croyances étranges, entre guillemets. Donc j'ai dit qu'il y avait une série de présentations, il y en a une troisième après-demain, mais elles sont toutes indépendantes les unes des autres. On peut évidemment assister à l'une d'elles sans assister aux trois. Kengo, je te laisse parler. Je sais pas si c'est...
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Maxime, for a kind introduction. I am so happy and honored to be here to present my work today in this wonderful room and before the wonderful audience. Thank you for coming. And I just want to make sure that everybody has a handout. If not, Alex, before beginning, I want to acknowledge that this talk, the material for this talk is going to be part of the book I am preparing with my wonderful co-authors Dan Williams and Sam Wilkinson. The book is called Delusions in the Social Mind, which is under contract with Oxford University Press. In this book, we will argue that delusions are social in two distinctive ways. One is that attributing delusions to someone or calling somebody delusional is a social act. The second aspect is that the way in which delusions are formed and maintained and developed is something there's something distinctive about the process in which delusions are formed, maintained, and developed. So if you want to know more about, so that's a very quick introduction of this project. If you want to know more about this, I am getting at some of this idea toward the end of this talk. But if you want to know more about it, I guess you gotta buy the book and read it. Anyway, so that's the background. Okay, so if you look at the definition of delusion in, for example, DSM-5, you will find something like this. So I'm not going to read it aloud, but I just want to draw your attention to the second half of it, where it says, despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. So the idea is that delusions are, by definition, supposed to be insensitive to evidence. So the people hold on to their delusions despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. This is just an example coming from DSM-5, but if you look at some other books or other diagnostic manuals where delusions are defined, you will find a similar idea everywhere. So the idea is that delusions are by definition insensitive to evidence. Now, question: is delusion? Is it really true that delusion is insensitive to evidence? So this is going to be the central question of this talk, and my answer will be. So that's the answer I'll be getting at toward the end of this talk. Is that it's actually complicated. It's complicated because on one hand, in some context, you may say delusions are insensitive to evidence, but in other contexts, in other respects, delusions are actually sensitive to evidence. And then the challenge will be how we can coherently make sense of this dual and contradictory features of delusions. On one hand, sensitive to evidence of some kind and insensitive to evidence of other kind. Oh, sorry. Yes. So I want to begin with an example to make it a bit concrete. So this is a case of a 33-year-old man with chronic schizophrenia. The patient had been ill for 14 years. At the time of the interview, he was preoccupied and distressed by the firm belief that he had no internal organs. So that's the delusion he has. Although his doctors had told him that this was a physiological impossibility, and despite some acknowledgement on the part of the patient that he could not quite understand how such a thing was possible, the patient said that he could not rid himself of the belief. Okay, I'll skip the other part. So basically, the patient has this delusional belief that he had no internal organs. Question: is his delusion sensitive to evidence? On one hand, you may say it's insensitive to, for example, a doctor's statement that it is a physiological impossibility that he has no internal organs. So doctor says that, and then that's a good evidence, that's a good medical evidence that the person who is alive, walking it, or had no internal organ whatsoever. It's a good piece of evidence. Looks like the patient piece of medical evidence. But on the other hand, if you look at the process in which the patient came up with this delusion in the first place, I think it is very likely that in this case, his delusion is a response to some abnormal somatic feelings he had. So he had some abnormal somatic feelings inside, and somehow he tried to explain these abnormal somatic feelings in terms of his delusion that he had no internal organs. But then, if that's the case, it looks as though he is actually sensitive to a piece of evidence which is coming from his abnormal somatic feelings. So he cares about this experience, this abnormal experience, as evidence, and he takes this evidence very seriously. That's the reason why he came up with his delusional idea that he had no internal organs. So, on one hand, he seems to be insensitive to evidence coming from, for example, doctor, but he is actually sensitive to the evidence coming from his own somatic feelings. And this is the dilemma or the puzzle of making sense of delusion and evidence. So the dilemma consists in the difficulty to explain the sensitivity and insensitivity simultaneously in a coherent manner. How can we make sense of these features at the same time in a coherent manner? I will, in the first half of this talk, I will be looking at different studies and theories of delusion formation and show that on one hand, some ideas nicely explain the sensitivity part, but they have difficulty in making sense of the insensitivity part. Other ideas or theories nicely explain the insensitivity part, but they have difficulty in making sense of the sensitivity part. So that's I'll be getting into it in a minute. By the way, so I just want to mention this wonderful paper by Ryan Mackay and Kengo Miyazono. I think it's published last week. I noticed this last week, so I added this in the last minute. Probably nobody has read this paper yet, but if you have, actually they talk about a very similar phenomenon, which is the, so this part. So deluded individuals seem to display both excessive credulity, being too willing to adopt usual beliefs on minimal evidence, and excessive rigidity, being unwilling to relinquish them in the face of stronger counter evidence. So they are getting a very similar dilemma here. By the way, Ryan Mackay is one of my co-authors, so of course our ideas get kind of similar. But I just want to mention this paper, and I highly recommend this paper. Okay, so let me begin with some clarifications of the puzzle. The first clarification is that when I talk about sensitivity to evidence, I don't necessarily mean rationality or rational sensitivity to evidence. So when I say that people with delusions are sensitive to evidence, I do not necessarily mean that they are rationally sensitive to evidence. People like Maher, the Brandon Maher, I think his view is that people are actually sensitive to evidence, sensitive to abnormal experience. So his idea is that delusions are responses to abnormal experiences. So that's his idea. So patients are sensitive to experience, and patients are rationally responsive to evidence. So that's his view. But that you don't have to accept something like that necessarily. So, for example, Stone and Young has an alternative idea that patients are sensitive to evidence or sensitive to experience, but not rational. So because they are too sensitive to evidence or too sensitive to the abnormal experience they have. So the idea is that, again, think about the somatic feeling case, the delusion that he has no internal organ. So the patient seems to be sensitive to evidence in the form of his abnormal somatic feelings. He is sensitive to the somatic feelings, but he might not be rationally sensitive to somatic feelings. Maybe he's too sensitive to them. So because abnormal somatic feelings are not sufficiently strong and rational evidence for the claim that he had no internal organs, but nonetheless the patient take it to be sufficient evidence. So you might think that the patient is actually too sensitive to evidence. So again, the point is just that when you say that patients are sensitive to evidence, it doesn't mean that patients are actually rationally sensitive to evidence. They might be too sensitive to evidence. The second clarification is that confirmation bias cannot be the whole story of this. So you might think that here's an easy account of this phenomenon, which is that the patient is sensitive to somatic feelings because they are coherent with and supportive of his delusional idea that he had no internal organs, right? And then he is insensitive to doctor's statement because it is incoherent with it. But then it looks like it's a familiar pattern in the literature of confirmation bias that you are sensitive to the evidence that confirms your own idea and you are insensitive to the evidence which disconfirms your evidence. So that isn't a familiar pattern. I don't think so. The reason is that somatic feelings are actually considered before adapting the delusional hypothesis, right? So if you look at the temporal structure of the delusion formation process, first he still believes that he has internal organs, but then he notices his abnormal somatic feelings, right? But in this case, the abnormal somatic feelings are actually not coherent with the belief he already had at that point, right? So just to clarify the temporal structure, I think a little bit of diagram might be helpful. So let's refer to a time in the process of delusion formation where he hasn't yet formed a delusional belief. So he still believes that he has internal organs. Because that's the prior belief he has at the time. So that's the time T1, and at the time T1 he hasn't formed a delusional belief yet. His prior belief is that I do have internal organs. So that's the belief he's got at T1. And then he faces the new piece of evidence coming from his abnormal somatic feelings. He feels like something is wrong in his body, in his organs. Okay. So I just want to call it, so this prior belief P1, and so P1 is the belief that I do have internal organs, and E1 is the evidence in the form of abnormal somatic feelings. So okay, now T2. So T2 is after the adoption of delusional hypothesis. So he already adopted the delusional idea that he has no internal organs. Okay. Now at T2, the prior belief is the delusional belief that he has no internal organs. Let's call it P2. And at T2, he faces new piece of evidence coming from doctor's statements. And then let's call it E2. Okay. Now, what we want to explain is the fact that on one hand, at T1, he is sensitive to E1. Right, he is sensitive to it, so that's the reason why he accepts and he adopts the delusional belief. On the other hand, at T2, he is not sensitive to E2. He is actually insensitive to E2. So that's the reason why he keeps believing that he has no internal organs, despite doctor's statements against it. The question is, how can we, in a coherent manner, explain the sensitivity to E1 and insensitivity to E2 at the same time? Some theories, as we'll see, nicely explain the sensitivity to E1, but not sensitivity to T2. Other theories, on the other hand, nicely explain insensitivity to E2, but not sensitivity to E1. Right, so now what I will be doing is to look at the actual examples of the studies of delusion formation. And then I'll show you how exactly this puzzle or dilemma arises in the context of the actual studies of delusion formation, in particular the studies of reasoning biases. Now, the most famous finding in the study of the reasoning of people with delusions is the finding of the jumping to conclusion bias. So if you are familiar with this, I think maybe I don't need to explain this, but just to make sure everybody is on board, I will explain this briefly. So here's the basic setting. So here's the task. We have two jars, mainly black jar and mainly orange jar, in which so here you have 85. So mainly black jar contains 85 black beads and 15 orange beads. And the mainly orange jar includes 85 beads and 15 black beads. So the ratio is the opposite. Okay. Now in the second stage, you mix them up like this. Okay. Now this is what I do. Now behind this desk, you can't see it, but there is a jar. And then this is either this one this one or this one, the black one or orange one, okay? So mainly black one or mainly orange one. So your task is tell which one I got here by looking at the bead I draw each time. So first I draw the first bead, okay? So I get the first one, and then I get the orange one, okay? So I get the orange one. And then if you know which one, I have it here, the mainly black one or mainly orange one. Well, you might think that, well, it is very likely that this is the one I got here, but let's see, let's see the second one, just in case, right? And then here's the second one, and the second one is actually orange, okay? Well, then it is very likely that this is the one I got here. But maybe if you want to, make it absolutely sure, here's the third one. So your task. So you can just raise your hand anytime you want. But your task is to tell the answer as quickly as possible, as quickly as you know it. Okay. And what researchers are looking at is how many beads you need before you come to the conclusion. Okay, so basically, every time I get the orange one. So orange one, the first one orange, the second one is orange, the third one is orange, the fifth one is orange, and the question is how many beads you need to come to the conclusion. Namely, it's this one. So this is the answer. This is the answer. So there's no question about that. But the question is how quickly you come to the conclusion. Okay. Now, if you do this experiment, comparing delusional group and a healthy group, you consistently find a statistically significant gap between those two groups, such that delusional group require less evidence in comparison to the healthy control before coming to the conclusion. So roughly speaking, so in the original experiment, on average, delusional group require only 2.2 beads. So 1 and 2, something like that. And the healthy group requires something like 3.6 bead on average. And the difference between them is statistically significant. So it looks as though this kind of research seems to suggest that people with delusions have this kind of bias to jump to the conclusion with little evidence. So that's jump to conclusion bias. Now, JTC bias nicely explains the sensitivity to E1. So E1 is the somatic feeling, so abnormal somatic feeling, right? At T1. So you can explain that because you have somatic feeling and they have this kind of bias, so they come to the conclusion, namely the delusional conclusion, very quickly with little evidence. So you can explain that. But you can't nicely explain the insensitivity to E2 at T2. By the way, E2 is the doctor's statement, right? Because if you have this kind of bias and you have the evidence coming from doctor that you do have internal organs, why they don't just jump to the conclusion and well then I do have organs, but it's not going to happen, right? So the question is, jump to the conclusion bias is empirically plausible, but this bias is not able to explain why people resist. So after adopting the delusional hypothesis, why they resist the evidence which is against the delusional hypothesis. It looks like they do not jump to the conclusion when it comes to the evidence which is against their delusional belief. Okay? And in fact, people like Gatti and Hensley says, well, this is paradoxical. Hard to explain. Davis and colleagues says that again, like this is hard to explain. The JTC bias cannot be the second factor for this reason. Second factor is something is an additional factor in the two-factor account. By the way, I'll get to the two-factor theory very soon. Okay, here is another also very famous finding in the delusion research, which is called the bias against disconfirmatory evidence. Okay. So this is also very interesting. So I'll go through the actual study. So the setting. The task of this is set up such that you are supposed to form a belief initially. So you accept a hypothesis in the beginning. And then after that, you face the disconfirmatory evidence, namely evidence against the hypothesis you adopted in the beginning. And what they look at is how much evidence you need before you abandon the hypothesis you adopted in the first place. Okay, so that's the setup. So you are supposed to accept the belief in the first place, but then you receive the counter evidence, and the question is how much counter evidence you need before you abandon the initial hypothesis. Okay, so that's the study, and in this version of the study, your task is to tell you what is this object which is depicted here. And at the first stage, initial stage, what you see is this one, and you are supposed to tell what this is. And you might say something like, well, it's a lemon. Does it look like a lemon? Let's say like it's lemon. Okay, so this is the first one. Okay, so that's the initial belief. So lemon is the initial belief, and now you are going to face the evidence against that initial belief. And the question is how much counter evidence you need before abandoning the lemon belief. So the second step, and then, okay, so here you say lemon, and here, is it still lemon? You might say, yes, it's a bit weird, but still it's lemon. Okay. And then you face this one, and then, is it still lemon? Possibly. It's a bit lemon, it's a bumpy, so a weird shaped lemon, you might say. How about this one? Does it? Well, probably lemon. But then, if you get to here or here, you probably abandon the initial estimate, and you say maybe it's a frog or something like that. Okay. So that's the setup, and you again compare the delusional group and non-delusional group and the healthy group. And then the finding, again, is that there is a statistically significant difference between those two groups, such that delusional group they tend to stick to the initial estimate. So in comparison to a healthy control group. So basically, they seem to be resisting the counter evidence or disconfirmatory evidence against the hypothesis they initially adopted. So this is why this is called the bias against disconfirmatory evidence. Bias against disconfirmatory evidence nicely explains the insensitivity to E2. By the way, E2 is doctor's statement, which is against the belief they have. So you can explain it, right? So if people have this kind of evidence, then you can explain why the patient does not take the doctor's statement into account. But then you face the problem of explaining the sensitivity to E1 at T1. Because E1 is actually somatic feelings, the abnormal somatic feeling. And actually, this somatic feeling is disconfirmatory with regard to P1. P1 is the belief that he has internal organs. So that's the belief he's got at T1. So you can't explain why he does not discount E1. So just go back. Oh no. Sorry. Yeah. So here's the thing. So you can explain why he is insensitive to this one, right? So he has this bias against this confirmatory evidence, and so that's the reason why he discounts this evidence, which is against the prior belief he has, namely the delusional belief. But then he is supposed to, so in order for him to be consistent, he is supposed to discount this one, the E1, which is against the prior belief he's got, namely the belief that he has internal organs. But he doesn't. He doesn't discount E1. So again, you can explain this bit, but you can't explain this bit. Yep. So okay, now I am getting into the third part of my talk, where I'll be talking about so-called two-factor theory of delusion formation. And again, the point of this discussion is to show with examples from two-factor theory how the dilemma arises exactly. The two-factor theory typically focuses on the category delusion. So I want to frame everything in terms of the category delusion, because that's the example they talk about a lot. So let's say T3 is when, so that's before the patient accepts. So let's say, so this is a case where a patient has the category delusion about the identity of his wife. Okay, so T3 is before he accepts the category delusion. His prior belief is that this woman is real wife. Let's call it P3, and then he faces new piece of evidence coming from reduced autonomic or affective response. Okay, so this is there's a good empirical evidence that the reduced autonomic or affective response is a factor in the formation of category delusion. Normal people show asymmetric autonomic or affective response between familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. It looks like this asymmetry is gone in people with delusions. So it looks like their autonomic or affective response to familiar faces, like the wife's face, seems to be reduced. So when it comes to the experience he's having, probably he is feeling something like he's looking at somebody who looks like his wife, but he doesn't feel as if this is the real wife. You don't have affective response to wife. So that's the evidence coming from experience he has. Now, T4 is after adopting the delusional belief. He's delusional now. Now, at T4, his prior belief is the Capgras delusional belief that this woman is an imposter. And then he faces new piece of evidence, for example, coming from trusted friends, saying that, well, this is your wife, this is definitely your wife, there's no question about that. Okay, so that T3, so now our task is to explain why he is sensitive to E3. So that's the evidence he takes into consideration, he takes into account, and he forms delusional belief in response to E3, right? So he's sensitive to E3, but he's not sensitive to E4, coming from trusted friend's statement. So how can we explain the insensitivity and sensitivity at the same time? So that's the puzzle. Two-factor theory is the view that delusions are explained by two distinct causal factors, the first factor and the second factor. In the case of Capgras delusion, the first factor is supposed to be reduced autonomic or affective response to familiar face. Again, the patient doesn't feel as if he's facing a real wife. So, the second factor, there's no consensus in the two-factor theory camp when it comes to the nature of the second factor. But I'll be looking at two famous notable proposals. One is from Hauts-de-France and colleagues, and the other is from Mackay. So that's... Now, these are a little bit of mathematics, but I think I want to make mathematics as little as possible. So basically, Hauts-de-France and colleagues account of their two-factor theory is based upon the Bayesian idea that the human belief formation is basically the Bayesian process of updating belief on the basis of evidence. But I'm not going to get into the details of the Bayesian approach, but I just want to draw your attention to this part. So now what you want to know, what you care about is how, whether it is P4, namely, that's the delusional hypothesis, this woman is an imposter. Or P3 is the wife hypothesis, it's a real wife. So what you want to know is whether it is the P4 is more plausible or P3 is more plausible given the E3. E3 is the abnormal autonomic affective response. So the question is whether, in Bayesian terms, so this is called the posterior probability of P4 given E3, and this is the posterior probability of P3 given E3. So question is whether this one is bigger or this one is bigger. So the translation into natural language is that is it more plausible that this woman is imposter, or is it more plausible that this woman is a real wife, given the abnormal autonomic response? So that's what this says. Okay. Now, Bayes' theorem says that if you want to know about it, you need to look at this part. So this is called the likelihood. So this is the likelihood of E3 given P4. So basically this says how well the P4 explains or predicts E3. So the translation into natural language is that how likely that you have the abnormal autonomic response given that the woman is an imposter. Okay, so this is what it means. And this is called the prior probability of P4. So this means in the natural language, this is about how plausible is it that this woman is an imposter without considering any evidence coming from the autonomic response. Okay. So so this is the prior probability of P4, and again you do the same thing with regard to P3. This is the likelihood of E3 given P3. So in natural language, this says how well the P3, how likely that you have the abnormal autonomic response given the assumption that the woman is the real wife. So this is the likelihood. And this is the prior probability of P3, so which is about how plausible is it that this woman is a real wife without considering the evidence coming from abnormal autonomic response. Okay. Now, so you compare this one multiplied by this one, and this one multiplied by this one, and then you see. So the question is, which one is bigger? Is this one is bigger or this one is bigger? Okay. So that's what you compare. So that's the setting. So that's the basic setting. Now, the Porterhead's view, according to Porterhead colleagues, they argue that the prior probability of P3 is bigger than the prior probability of P4, which is to say that without considering any new evidence, it is more likely that this woman is wife rather than an imposter. Kind of plausible. Right? On the other hand, the likelihood of E3 given P4 is much bigger than the likelihood of E3 given P3, which is to say that it is more likely that you have the abnormal, you feel the unfamiliarity to this person, given P4, given the assumption that this woman is not your wife, the imposter, than the assumption that this woman is real wife. Because if the woman is real wife, then it is expected that you have the real familiarity, but you don't get it, right? The lack of familiarity is E3. So P4, anyway, the imposter hypothesis predicts or explains better than the wife hypothesis. The experiment predicts the abnormal lacking of familiarity better. So given this, they conclude that the posterior probability of P4 given E3 is bigger than the posterior probability of P3 is given E3, which is to say that given the abnormal experience or lack of familiarity, imposter hypothesis is more plausible than the wife hypothesis. So far so good, but their claim is that patient irrationally discount E4. E4 is coming from the statement of friends, saying that this is a real wife. And then, which is why P4 persists. despite counter evidence. So he faces counter evidence, which is coming from trusted friend, but he discounts the evidence, which is why he sticks to his own belief, which is P4, the imposter hypothesis. Now, so this is called terms theory. This view nicely explains the insensitivity to E4. So he has this bias of discounting evidence against his own belief, but not sensitivity to E3 T3. So E4 is the statement of friends, E3 is the abnormal experience, abnormal autonomic or affective experience. He is actually sensitive to E3, and this theory is not able to explain that. So possibly you might say that the bias of discounting evidence, discounting counter evidence, is acquired after T3. So you don't have the bias at this point, and you acquire the bias at some point between T3 and T4. So that's why he discounts this one, he doesn't discount this one. That's plausible, but that's a bit strange for you, because you don't. That's a kind of miraculous coincidence that he's got the evidence between T3 and T4. So Ryan Mackay calls this the implausible chronology objection to Haudt and colleagues. So Mackay, his view is different. This is the same. So his view is different. So he argues that the prior probability of P3 is actually much bigger than the prior probability of P4, which is to say that before considering evidence, it is much more likely that the woman in your house, looking like the wife, is the real wife rather than the imposter. Okay, so that's 1B. On the other hand, the likelihood of E3 given P4 is much bigger than the likelihood of E3 given P3, which is to say that it is more likely that you have the abnormal autonomic response given the assumption that the woman is imposter than the assumption that the woman is your wife. And from these, they irrationally conclude that the posterior probability of P4 given E3 is bigger than the posterior probability of P3 given E3, which is to say that it is more plausible that the woman is imposter rather than the real wife given the abnormal autonomic and affective response, which is irrational because so this reasoning is actually irrational because this does not follow from these. So why they conclude this way? According to Mackay, they do this because they have the bias of discounting prior probability ratio, which is this. Okay. So they discount this bit and they focus on this bit. That's the reason why they conclude this. So that's the account. So Mackay's theory nicely explains the sensitivity to E3 at T3. So by the way, E3 is the abnormal autonomic response or affective response. But not insensitivity to E4 at T4, the evidence coming from your friends. Because at T4, what's happening is something like this. So at T4, so that's after the adoption of delusion. What you have is that the prior probability of P4 is bigger than the prior probability of P3, which is to say that you take it more plausible that the woman is an imposter rather than the wife. That's what you believe when you're delusional, right? But on the other hand, you have E4, that's the evidence coming from it, your friend. And then P3, which is the wife hypothesis, explains this better than P4, which is the imposter hypothesis, right? So it is, given the assumption that the wife, the woman is the real wife, you can nicely explain and predict the fact that your friend is saying that this woman is your real wife, okay? So, but then, if people have the bias of discounting prior probability ratio, then he's gonna discount this, and then he focus on this, and the result should be that he abandons the delusional belief, and he comes to the conclusion that the woman is real wife, but it's not gonna happen. So Mackay's theory is not able to explain why the patient is insensitive to E4 at T4. Okay. A little bit of mathematics, but hopefully you get the basic idea. Now, so this is the last part of my talk. How much time I've got? 5 minutes or so. Okay, good. Now, just to summarize the dilemma I just described to you so far. So the dilemma consists in the difficulty of explaining simultaneously the sensitivity to some evidence and insensitivity to other evidence. Some theories nicely explain the former, but not the latter. The other theories nicely explain the latter, but not the former. The question is how then you can explain them simultaneously in a coherent manner. I think a solution, or at least the beginning of solution, would be to reject the assumption that people respond to all kinds of evidence in the same way. So the idea is that there are different kinds of evidence, and then depending on the kinds of evidence, people respond in different ways. So possibly they're sensitive to some kind of evidence, but they are insensitive to other kind of evidence. So if you accept something like this, this can be the beginning of the solution of the dilemma. So that's my view. Now the question is, okay, suppose that's on the right track, and the question is going to be about what is the some kind of evidence to which people are sensitive to? What's the kind of evidence people are insensitive to? So that's the substantial question. Now, so here's my theory so this is where I'm coming to the project I introduced to you in the beginning of my talk. That's a book project. This is part of it. I have this account developed in a paper earlier. I published earlier, and then this is going to be the part of the book. That people are sensitive to individualistic evidence, the kind of evidence which is typically take the form of some kind of experience. So, for example, abnormal somatic feelings, that's your own experience. An abnormal autonomic affective experience, that's the case of the Capra delusion. especially sensitive to this kind of evidence, the experiential evidence or individualistic evidence. They are insensitive to social evidence, what I call social evidence, the evidence coming from other people. For example, doctor's statement that it is physiologically impossible that you have no organs, or trusted friend's testimony that this woman is definitely your wife. So this kind of evidence is coming from other people. And then, yeah, so this is the paper I published in 2021. And then I gave a detailed account of why this happens. Why is it that people, especially insensitive to testimonial evidence or social evidence coming from other people? So I just want to make it very quick because the time is running out. So my idea is that social impairment in schizophrenia can cause two things. One is the loss of epistemic interaction with others. I call it testimonial isolation. So basically this is where you lose your conversation with other people. You lose the opportunities to discussions, for discussions or conversations or sharing information in others. You are socially isolated. You're not going to talk with other people in the first place. And second, the failure of trusting testimony. You still do interact with other people, but you're not going to trust what they say. So I call it testimonial discount. And then they explain why delusions are maintained despite the obvious counter-evidence, or why delusions get elaborated into the complicated systems of belief. And social impairment responsible testimonial isolation. So isolation is the loss of epistemic interaction with others. Include social skill impairment in schizophrenia, social cognition impairment in schizophrenia, and social anhedonia. So social anhedonia is where you no longer feel pleasure in the social interaction with others. So because of these impairments, you lose your chances and opportunities to interact with others epistemically. Social impairments responsible for testimonial discount, so you're going to trust others, include discounting the competence of the testifier and discounting the cooperativeness of the testifier. So this idea is familiar from the epistemology, the philosophical literature on testimony. So basic idea is that whether you trust somebody's testimony depends on two things: how competent you are, how competent the person is when it comes to the topic he's talking about. If he knows a lot, then you're going to trust him. If he doesn't know a lot, then you're not going to trust him. So that's competence. And the second thing is cooperativeness. If this person is trustworthy, he's not going to deceive you, then you're going to trust this person. But if he is malicious, he's not going to deceive you. He's not going to he's going to deceive you. Then you're not going to trust the person. So that's the cooperativeness part. Okay. My idea is that the people with delusions tend to discount the competence of other people and the cooperativeness of other people. So that's the reason why they fail to trust the testimony from others. And why they discount the competence and cooperativeness? of other people. Well, maybe you have paranoia thoughts or feelings that people are trying to harm you or deceive you or trick you or harass you. Then you don't think that people are very cooperative. They are easily deceive you, so you don't trust those people. Or if you have a grandiose idea that you have some special insights into some issues, then you feel that you are competent because you have special insight, and in comparison to you, the other people are not very competent. So you want to discount the competence of other people. The third item is the failure of group identification, which is basically the idea that the people with delusion fail to identify themselves as the member of the same group as other people. So difficulty of identifying themselves as group members. So that's the idea. So if you are not able to identify yourself as a group member, then you feel that you are isolated, you are hearing other people, you don't share the same group as other people. And since you don't share the same group with other people, you don't want to trust them. You can trust the people in your own group, because in your own group, maybe people are cooperative, they're not going to deceive you. So that's the idea. Okay, so this is the summary, this is the end of my talk. So I talked about the dilemma where the problem is the difficulty of explaining the sensitivity and insensitivity at the same time. And at the end of my talk, I suggested a way out of the dilemma, which is the idea that people are sensitive to individualistic evidence, but insensitive to social evidence coming from other people. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kengo, for the very interesting talk. I'm going to start a Q&A with one question, and first I want to remind everyone that after the Q&A there is a buffet, so don't go away too quick, there's food and drinks. So, but just an aside, my question is, you've put aside the question of rationality and focus on sensitivity to evidence. I want to bring back not the question of rationality, but of normality. I was wondering whether it's so abnormal to be more sensitive to individualistic evidence, such as experience, to be more sensitive to this kind of evidence than to testimony. Yeah. When people have functional pains, for example, the doctor can explain them that they have no organic disorder, that it's just psychological pain, functional pain. It will be very hard for them to believe in, or it might take time. It's not delusion, it seems to be quite normal. I mean, that some experiences are so strong and so authoritative.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to, that's a very good point. And then I want to refer to this paper, because this paper addresses the point very nicely. So their idea is that this asymmetry between experiential evidence and testimonial evidence or social evidence is normal. So normal people have this tendency to take their own evidence at face value, because that's their own evidence. So there's little room to doubt it. They have this evolutionary idea that it doesn't give you much evolutionary advantage when you are very careful about your own evidence. On the other hand, from an evolutionary point of view, it makes a lot of sense to be a little bit careful about the kind of evidence coming especially the people coming from other groups, for example. They have this idea that this asymmetry is actually healthy in the normal population, but this asymmetry is exaggerated in schizophrenia, so that's the idea. I think that's plausible. To me, I mean, that's not my idea, that's theirs.
So, oops. Any questions? Okay, I think I'm gonna.
Oh, okay.
Because this one doesn't seem to.
Thank you very much for this very insightful talk. I was wondering, because you did not mention it during the presentation, but how could you relate your theory and proposition to account for this dilemma to the question of uncertainty? I mean, all the information that are taken in these examples do not have exactly the same value. For instance, social information are highly uncertain. It's very difficult to understand others, and we know that metacognitive skills is often involved in psychiatric disorders in general. So do you think there is something to do in this dilemma, I mean, with the uncertainty of the information and the evidence you need to process? Thank you.
Okay. Right, I think that could be, uncertainty can be part of the story. So if I understand your proposal, maybe the social evidence, the evidence coming from other people tend to be uncertain. It can be ambiguous. On the other hand, when it comes to the evidence coming from yourself, the experience, it's not uncertain, and then that could be the part of the story. Maybe I think that can be part of the story, but I'm not really sure if you go on to say that it's not so much about the kind of evidence which explains the asymmetry. It's just that what matters is just the degree of certainty. Just the point is just that if the evidence is certain, then you care about it very, very carefully. If the evidence is not very certain, that's it. And there's no intrinsic distinction between experiential stuff and social stuff. I don't want to go all the way to that strong view, because I think that the distinction between experiential evidence and social evidence is important, no matter what you're going to say about a certainty and uncertainty. So the answer to your question is that I think that can be part of the story, but I don't think that's the whole story.
So, thank you for your talk, and my question was, obviously I'm willing to agree with your hypothesis, because it opens a lot of very interesting ideas for reflecting on strange beliefs, in the case of delusions, but also in the other cases of strange beliefs that are socially shared, such as complotism or New Age theories and so on. But concerning the cases you presented here, and even if I find your explanation of the asymmetry of evidence quite convincing, wouldn't it be more parsimonial to think that in both cases the main difference is that the testimonial evidence is things that happen at other, when you meet your doctor, when you meet your friend, whereas the first evidence is in both cases something that has a duration. You keep on feeling that your body is empty. You keep on feeling that the imposters looks like your wife, but you don't feel familiar with her. So maybe wouldn't be an easier explanation to say that these evidences are prevailing because of their durability.
Okay. Thanks. So your proposal, the parsimonious proposal, is supposed to be that the reason why they are sensitive to the abnormal feeling is because you feel it all the time, but testimonial evidence is not. There are two questions. One is the question of rationality, and one is a question of rationality. The other one is a question of psychology. First of all, the rationality question is whether, if you keep the same feeling, does it make any evidential difference? So you, at T1, you have abnormal somatic feeling, and then in a moment later you still have it. And then again a moment later you still keep having it. The question is, from an epistemological point of view, this, the fact that you keep having it makes any evidential difference. The question is whether it makes it more plausible that you don't have any internal organs. So I think that's tricky issue, because if you say each moment is crucial, each moment counts, then I think you will soon have huge amount of evidence about experiential stuff, and then you're not gonna rationally get out of it because you have but that's the question of rationality. So I think it's difficult because it's difficult to individuate the evidence. Here's the piece of evidence, here's the another. I think the individuation of evidence in that kind of case can be a little bit difficult. So that's the rationality question, the epistemology question. Now the psychology question is about whether that is the reason why people stick to the delusional belief rather than possibly that could be the case, whether or not it is a rational thing to do. That could be the case, but I wonder, a worry I can think of right now is that if that's the case, I think it is puzzling that people can get out of their delusional experience at all. It's just that that seems to make the abnormal experience so powerful, such that you are not gonna get out of it at all. But eventually they get out of it, in many cases at least. So yeah.
Yes.
My question is, does the solution suggest that patients with delusions are not biased at all? Or can we still maintain that we can find the causes to make paranoia and other stuff, but they still are biased because they jump to conclusion, they do only take into account instances that go on on their way. So are we getting rid of the biases, or can we still maintain them just to understand their behavior, I would say?
Mm. Okay. So am I right that, so your question is whether we can still have something like this in the account of delusion? Is that your question? Okay, good. That's very good. So I think so. So I think that's a good point. So I said I looked at the biases like jumping to conclusion bias. I looked at the bias against disconfirmatory evidence, and I also looked at different versions of two-factor theory. So my point of this exercise of going through this and showing that they face the bias is not to show that they are wrong or they are not the part of the story. The point is rather that they will be insufficient. So you need to say something more than that. In fact, I think empirical evidence, I mean, we do have good empirical evidence that delusion has a correlation with the strength of jumping to conclusion bias and also to the strength of the bias against disconfirmatory evidence. So I think we have some reason to think that they are part of the story. So the point is that they are not the whole story. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're gonna finish now. And je vous rappelle qu'il y a un buffet où vous pourrez poser des questions à Kengo Miyazono. So we can continue the discussion with something to eat or drink. Thank you.